G'day folks, my name is Rob and welcome back for another F1 fantasy video. In today's video, we're going to go through my Limitless chip usage guide, how to optimize the deployment of that chip and capitalize on the advantages it can present to you on sprint and non-sprint weekends. So if you're new around here, as always, be sure to drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel. If you haven't got to that point already, thank you again, guys, for all of the ongoing engagement throughout the season in F1 fantasy. It's been a whirlwind few races and looking forward to the rest of the season ahead. So the crux of the video today is going to dissect whether Limitless is more effective to use on sprint or non-sprint weekends. There's been debate and discussion around the last 12 months or so on this chip, given it is one of the most powerful in the game. So I want to understand some of the best times to deploy it. Now, as we all know, in news to absolutely no one in F1 fantasy, sprint weekends offer more points because of that extra racing session. Limitless, given it's targeted towards the top drivers and constructors, as a result will fetch you more points and likely have some of the highest scores throughout the season. But the key consideration when using the chip is whether you're able to bridge the gap to teams that are not using the Limitless chip that weekend. And I think what I mean by that, and if you don't already kind of understand or are familiar with the terminology, is identifying that points difference, or delta as some people refer to it as, between Limitless and non-Limitless users. In the instance of a simple example I'll describe for you just now, let's take Team 1 for example. Team 1 scores 60 more points in the Miami sprint race weekend on Limitless than non-Limitless teams. If we take Team 2 for example, Team 2 activates it on a non-sprint weekend. Let's take Monaco as an example. But the Team 2 actually scores 80 points more than non-Limitless teams in Monaco. So I guess the reference or the example I'm making of the delta is that the Team 1 in Miami Limitless scores 60, Team 2 in Monaco scores 80 more. Team 2 is actually better off, 20 points better off in this example. Now, I know that's a very basic explanation of the chip, but the reason I use these two tracks as examples is because they actually do feed into the methodology around when the best time or optimal times to use the chip consists of. Now, in terms of timing, and before we get into the examples on the screen here, you might already kind of know what I'm about to share with you if you follow me on Twitter, because I've put out a tweet recently going through some of my analyses on this. But timing, not just from the chip itself, but also for your pre-Limitless team, is essential because you will be getting the price changes of your non-Limitless team on the Limitless weekend. So again, if we take Miami sprint weekend as an example and you use Limitless, then the price changes you get from that weekend in Miami will be based on the team you had at the end of the Saudi Arabia Grand Prix weekend, the weekend preceding Miami. You cannot make transfers before you activate Limitless to chase budget or, I guess, exploit some kind of loophole. That will not work. So any price changes you get will obviously be a huge factor in, or at least what you expect will be a huge factor in perhaps when you choose to activate Limitless. So I want to walk you through some optimal lineups versus Limitless lineups on sprint weekends over the last few seasons. I'm going to take a number of assumptions into account here with how these calculations have been made, but in the essence of these tables and charts here, we are taking the best Limitless team from the weekends on screen here and the most optimal non-Limitless teams for that same weekend. I've got my assumptions and notes in the bottom here. I'm not going to go through every single one, but I'll leave that for you guys to read when you can. But ultimately, trying to understand the delta, the points variance between the Limitless and the non-Limitless teams. I've used the same performance scale we use for price changes to make it a little bit easier to gauge the effectiveness of using the Limitless chip on these sprint race weekends. And China is the one that stands out to me the most. China last year, which is what stands out to me the most, because we had so many drivers, top drivers from top teams qualify out of position and make overtakes and positions gained. Now, the problem with sprint race weekends is that it actually can work in favor of your midfield drivers, because with how the point scoring is weighted, it means that there is actually opportunity for midfield drivers to score just as much, if not even more, than some of the drivers in the top teams that would just qualify and finish the sprint race in the same position. The reason that is because points assigned in the sprint is for placement for the top 8 drivers, 8 through to 1, as opposed to the Grand Prix, which is 25 to 1. Now, if we take someone like Lando Norris, for example, qualifies and finishes the sprint race in second with 7 points, compared to someone like Ollie Behrman, who might come from P18 up to P12, gets 5 overtakes, 6 positions gained, 11 points for Behrman. That 11, just because of the positions gained and the overtakes, as they're weighted equally in the Grand Prix, will outscore a driver in a higher position on the grid, like Lando Norris, for example, that doesn't actually make much change or much movement across that sprint race session. So that is obviously a thing to keep in mind, and is why midfield drivers, if you pick them correctly, can actually do just or close to as well as some of these top drivers in the sprint race weekend. And that's why China was an outlier, as I say, because the top drivers in the top teams qualified out of position and made additional passes and gained positions to obviously push them further up the point scoring leaderboard in that race weekend. If we look at the 5 other examples on the screen here, and I've taken races in the first half of the season. As we all know, Limitless is optimal to use when team values are lower, so you can obviously have more of an advantage over non-Limitless teams. There isn't actually all that much to be impressed about. Austria, Belgium 2023, 30 odd points advantage. I think 2023 is probably an outlier, even for a race like Monza as well, which we'll talk about more in the next slide. But because Aston Martin and McLaren template assets that were performing very well that season were underpriced, the delta is compressed. Now, last year, for example, Miami, 54 points. I used it then. Good, but not great. Austria, again, we obviously not taking into account Norris and Verstappen, popular Limitless picks then. Again, not a very big delta. And then China, 67 points this year. Good, but not great. We're obviously excluding Ferrari from that calculation. But I'm not exactly encouraged by the kind of potential from using Limitless on these sprint race weekends. Probably the variance, the delta was much lower than perhaps what I would have anticipated or expected before jumping into the analyses. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean sprints are bad weekends to use them, but I do want to give you yardsticks to obviously articulate that it doesn't actually on sprint weekends provide as much upside as we might think when we simply just look at the raw points scored on that weekend. And you take China out of the equation, on the bottom right hand side of the colored chart, 46.4 is the average delta across the 5 races when excluding China. We look at non-sprint weekends, tells a very different story. I know we've got, again, selected weekends in here, but I've intentionally chosen tracks with low overtake rates because that's where Limitless on non-sprint weekends is most effective in the first half of the season. Now, again, Monza 2023, I could have included in here because a lot of people used it then to great effect. But I think that is probably an outlier where we wouldn't ordinarily be using Limitless that late in the season. And again, kind of going back to my point earlier, the template that year was more or less geared towards McLaren and Aston Martin because they were grossly underpriced. But that weekend, Mercedes and Ferrari did well, obviously differential assets at a premium price tag. So if we're focusing on Saudi Arabia, Imola, Monaco, Silverstone, and Japan this year, all tracks that have historically low overtake rates. I've shared a screenshot previously on the channel here just around overtakes, and I'll bring it up one more time from my friend Adam at Fantasy HQ. This is from the tweet I was referring to earlier. The examples I've used, Silverstone, Japan, Monaco, Imola, all in the bottom half for overtakes over the last 3 years. So targeting tracks with low overtakes because naturally on Limitless for non-sprint weekends, we just want drivers that will qualify and finish in the top 5, and the back markers and midfield drivers actually don't have that many opportunities to rack up points through overtakes and positions gained. So that's why I've used the and referred to the tracks on screen here as examples to delve into in more detail. So Saudi Arabia, very much a popular discussion point as we're approaching the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix at the time of recording. 50 to 60 points. On my grading scale, you might have a different perspective on what's terrible, poor, good, or great. Is probably in the midpoint of poor. Like, I think if you want to be getting the most out of Limitless, you obviously need some luck, absolutely. But good is probably around where you want that outcome to be based. Monaco, another low overtake track. Probably expected it to be, again, slightly higher because backmarkers really don't get that much. But at the same time, the drivers that did well on Limitless, so the Ferraris and the McLarens, which finished top 4 in Monaco last year, were also template picks at the time. So the variance wouldn't have been actually all that great. If it was, let's say, Mercedes and Red Bull or something where where us players couldn't get to, then obviously their delta would be even bigger than that. Imola for me, another low overtake track, low DNF rate at this track, one I'm very much eyeing off for this season. And then Japan, probably one of the best in recent memory to use Limitless this year. Wasn't really on the menu for a lot of us, but definitely proved to us in that absolute snooze fest of a race weekend that those who used it then actually turned out to be very lucky. And we can see here, taking the average of all of these 6 samples, 70 points for using the Limitless chip on a non-sprint weekend versus if we go back to the other screen, 58.8 or even 46.4 if you take out the China outlier, a delta of 25 points. That's good for a DNF. So obviously a huge factor to consider here. And I think for me, definitely makes the case that Miami isn't perhaps as obvious to us using it this season as it might have been a couple race weekends ago. Now, the last thing to wrap up with using the Limitless chip are just some use case considerations and optimal times to use the chip. Now, we've talked about a number of tracks, a number of factors. Just want to bring it all together for you guys watching so it can actually make more sense to what we need to look out for. For the sprint race weekends, already talked about it, but you want front-running drivers that qualify out of position. We have it in on that through seeing sprint qualifying before the deadline. And I know there is some consideration around Parc Ferme. Adam from Fantasy HQ mentioned that earlier today to me, that unlike previous seasons, teams can change their setup between the sprint race and qualifying. So it may not be as easy as actually having the front-running drivers wipe the floor. There is some opportunity for midfield drivers to claw back, but notwithstanding that, you want drivers, as I said, to qualify out of position, to have the opportunity to make overtakes, gain positions, and score more than just what would ordinarily be attained from, say, finishing P3 or qualifying the sprint and finishing P3. So the upcoming sprint weekends in the first half of the season is Miami, a couple of race weekends away, and Belgium. Belgium may be a little too far, but I also wouldn't be against the idea of using it then. It is a track that does lend itself to overtakes, a few really nice overtaking zones there. If we look at non-sprint weekends, already talked about it again, but drivers in the top teams that qualify and finish in the same or a similar position. So ideally differential teams where we all can't afford. So let's say Ferrari and McLaren are back in the template, or maybe it's Ferrari, Red Bull, because they're out of favor assets in the template right now. It's very much geared towards Mercedes and McLaren. I think if you're able to capitalize on a weekend where off-template assets are doing well and you get them to finish in the top 5, that's really going to set you apart. And then overtaking, again, is difficult for all drivers. So the tracks that stand out to me, Saudi Arabia, Imola, Monaco, and Silverstone. I've got Miami and Imola in bold on the screen here because they're the 2 tracks for me as of right now where I am weighing up using the Limitless chip. I could wait until Monaco. I could wait until Silverstone. But I almost feel like same with the 3X chip dilemma last year, the longer you leave it, the more it backs you into a corner of having to use it at a track that, even though it might be a good track to use it at, may not be the best. So I'm going to probably do some further deliberation, but right now Miami and Imola for me are probably the 2 standouts. And then how to best optimize the use. Again, you want to target tracks with low DNF rates, which is why it's putting me off Saudi. Although we've only had a couple in each of the last 2 races at the track there, Lance Stroll actually being the common denominator in 2023 and 2024, it is still an extremely fast track. Very narrow corners and corridors to navigate. Experienced drivers are obviously paramount to have success and obviously avoid the DNF minefield there. And then you also, as we've also talked about, target or have assets in your pre-limitless team that are going to rise in value or preserve value, which is why, just because my team is not as optimally set up right now, I've got Doohan, I've got Ocon, drivers that may well drop in price in Saudi Arabia, why I'm perhaps not looking at that right now. But if you're able to have at least 5, maybe 6 assets expected to rise in price heading into the upcoming Limitless weekend you choose to activate it at, I think that will set you up quite nicely for budget gains. As you know, we get the budget gains of our non-Limitless team when we activate Limitless. And then, as I've stressed, and I think is news again to absolutely nobody in F1 Fantasy, earlier in the season is a greater differential when not many teams have the cost cap advantage that we might otherwise be able to accrue later in the year. So that's going to be kind of my summary. I've probably missed a couple of points because there's been so much information flying thick and fast. Tom, Ewan, Rain, Adam, Zach, everyone's been covering off Limitless to varying degrees in the community. So be sure to check out their content for some variation. But I'm going to leave it there for now, guys. I'll be back with my final thoughts later this week. But drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And I will see you all very soon.